Imagine you're a leader trying to advance a moral cause at a time when the country is deeply divided. I spoke with historians H.W. Brands, Eric Foner, David Blight, and Drew Faust about the story of Abraham Lincoln and the abolition of slavery in the United States. I'm David Rubenstein. All my life, I've been passionate about American history. I think that by learning from the past, we can better shape the future. I've spent years interviewing experts to learn more about the U.S. presidency and American power. In this series, I revisit these interviews and bring their stories to light. In 1860, around 4 million black people were enslaved in the U.S. Slavery was vital to the cotton industry in the South, but there had been a growing view, especially in the North, that the institution was immoral and should be abolished. Abraham Lincoln, running for president as the nominee from the new Republican Party, had spoken against the expansion of slavery. But as H.W. Brands and Eric Foner explained, on the campaign trail, he chose his words carefully.
Lincoln has to kind of make sure that he doesn't scare off any moderate voters. He was constantly accused by his opponents of being an abolitionist. He said, no, as president, I wouldn't have the power, nor do I have the inclination to try to tamper with slavery in the states where it exists.
Lincoln believed or understood, if you're going to get rid of slavery, you need the cooperation of slave owners. There's no way to do it against their will, and therefore his plan was gradual emancipation, so it didn't disrupt things right away.
As a result, those wholeheartedly against slavery weren't sure what to make of Lincoln. One of them was a national leader of the abolitionist movement and prominent orator who himself had escaped slavery, Frederick Douglass. He's someone historian David W. Blight has written about extensively.
Douglass had a somewhat insider's view of the development of policy in the United States. But above all, it's Douglass, the speaker, and the writer who left more words to make us think about this problem of race than, frankly, anybody else. He's the prose poet of American democracy.
Does Douglass support Lincoln in 1860?
Very mildly. He wasn't sure yet by 1860 just what could be trusted from his point of view about this Republican Party, which stood pretty clearly for stopping the expansion of slavery. They were saying to Southerners, you will not expand this system into the Western territories because there we can control jurisdiction. But Douglass looked in vain for a moral core to their argument. However, Douglass came to understand that if you're attacking slavery in the West, you're really attacking it everywhere.
So Lincoln gets elected, but as soon as he's elected, the southern states begin to secede, or a number of them. Why were they seceding since he said he wasn't going to get rid of slavery in those states?
Well, first of all, how did Lincoln win? He didn't get a vote in most of the southern states. He carried the entire North, and because the North was more populous, you carry the North, you win the Electoral College. And so Southerners said, wait a minute, here's a guy who doesn't owe us anything. He has no votes in the South. But more to the point, Lincoln had spoken eloquently and powerfully against slavery. The very idea that the president would be hostile to slavery was not something they could accept.
By April 1861, 11 southern states had seceded from the Union to form the Confederacy. Civil War broke out, and at first, both sides underestimated their enemy.
He becomes president, he's inaugurated, the Civil War breaks out, but people think, okay, we have 3 times as many people in the North as in the South. This war will be over in a couple weeks.
Well, neither side was prepared for large-scale warfare at this time. This is at the very beginning of the war. So the Union Army marches down into Virginia. Richmond is the capital of the Confederacy. This is July 1861, and they're met by a Confederate army, and at first the Union Army pushes them back, and then reinforcements come, and they push the Union back, and then everyone runs away, basically. It has no strategic importance, this battle, but it at least gets rid of the idea that this is just going to be a short, glorious war. You know, people now begin to realize, wait a minute, this is going to be a big deal. On paper, how could the South win? On paper, the North is, whether it's population, industry, finance, you name it, the North is way ahead. But wars are not fought on paper. The South did not have to invade and conquer the North, but the North had to invade and conquer the South.
The war dragged on, and Lincoln's official position on slavery evolved. At first, he had only publicly opposed the expansion of slavery, but on January 1st, 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that all enslaved people in Confederate areas under control of the Union Army were henceforth free. Historian Drew Gilpin Faust explained to me Lincoln's reasoning behind this change.
When the war broke out and he saw that he could define slavery as an instrument of strength and war power for the South, in other words, having slavery enabled the South to mobilize more white men for the military, he could then define slavery as something that had to be defeated in order to enable military victory.
He says that it's slavery that is enabling them to keep these armies in the field, that is providing the materiel for the Confederate Army, that's growing the food. You've got to go after the infrastructure of Southern society. Slavery is the cause of this war, and if we don't act against it, we will never be able to solve this fundamental problem in our societies. But also, you need more manpower. You know, up to that point, they didn't let blacks in the Army, but at this point, you need every man you can get.
The Emancipation Proclamation enabled black men to join the Union Army. Frederick Douglass worked vigorously to recruit them, and they signed on by the thousands. Most had fled slavery on plantations in the South. But despite providing much-needed military support, they faced terrible mistreatment. And Frederick Douglass quickly took the matter to Lincoln himself.
The discriminations against black troops were brutal. Douglass had gone to Washington with no invitation. He went to Lincoln to complain about this and demand that change. He went to the White House, just got in line, the famous lines that would gather at Lincoln's White House, and asked to see the president. And lo and behold, Lincoln let him in. Lincoln made no real promises at that point. They had what today in diplomatic language they both called, in effect, a good exchange of ideas.
And by the end of the war, something like 200,000 black soldiers have fought in the Union Army, which actually makes a big impression on Lincoln, leading to, you know, his thinking about the post-war world, that they have earned the right to citizenship by fighting and dying for the country.
Lincoln would never see these plans become reality. Less than a week after Confederate surrender in April 1865, he was assassinated. 8 months later, the ratification of the 13th Amendment abolished slavery in the United States for good and began the period known as Reconstruction, which Lincoln had hoped would bind up the nation's wounds.
Reconstruction is a long, complicated story. The effort to secure the basic rights of the 4 million former slaves, to enforce the law, to enforce the new Constitution, which is, you know, put into place in Reconstruction, that failed, obviously. And it's succeeded by a long period of Jim Crow, of just disenfranchisement, of inequality. In some ways, it's a very inspiring story. It's a time when black and white people worked together in the South in a common cause of justice. It's a very depressing story. You get homegrown terrorism, the Klan and other groups working hard to just overthrow and annihilate this. And since it doesn't succeed, it leaves to future generations this problem of racial justice.
Throughout the course of his career, President Lincoln continually exhibited expert political instincts. As his own beliefs evolved based on what he saw and what he learned, he pushed a divided country toward morality and reconciliation.